Liebe Freunde des Berliner Antike-Kollegs, Interessierte an altertumswissenschaftlicher Forschung, liebe Studierende, Kolleginnen und Kollegen, meine Damen, meine Herren, seien Sie herzlich willkommen zum Frühjahrsabend des Berliner Antike-Kollegs, zu unserer Auftaktveranstaltung zum BAK-Jahresthema 2023-24. Ich begrüße namentlich Petra Knaus, Vizepräsidentin für Forschung der Freien Universität Berlin, Dagmar Schäfer, geschäftsführende Direktorin des Max-Planck-Instituts für Wissenschaftsgeschichte. Unter unseren auswärtigen Gästen Kaya Harter-Uiberpu, Co-Sprecherin des Hamburger Exzellenzclusters Understanding Written Artifacts, Ortwin Dalli, ersten Direktor des Deutschen Archäologischen Instituts Abteilung Rom, Ralf Bodenstein, zweiter Direktor des Deutschen Archäologischen Instituts Abteilung Kairo und last but not least den Meister diesen Abends, unseren Keynote-Speaker David Nirenberg, Direktor des Institut for Advanced Study Princeton. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass Sie heute unserer Einladung gefolgt und an diesem milden Frühlingsabend auf die Museumsinsel gekommen sind. An jenen eminenten Ort der Geschichte, nicht allein der Kulturgeschichte, die in ihren Museumsräumen inszeniert ist, auch der in ihrer Architektur materialisierten Geschichte der Entstehung und Entfaltung der Berliner Antikeforschung im 19. Jahrhundert, nicht minder auch der in den Versehrungen und Narben ihrer Fassaden eingeschriebenen Geschichte toxischer Politik im 20. Jahrhundert. Das Auditorium, in dem wir versammelt sind, evoziert in der Memoria ihres bedeutendsten Mäzens, des Patrioten und jüdischen Weltbürgers James-Simon, die Geschichte gesellschaftlicher Konfliktbewältigung durch Philanthropismus und Gemeinsinn. Herzlich willkommen in einem Wort in diesem für unsere Agenda höchst stimmigen Ambiente. Bevor Ihnen Philipp von Rummel unseren Keynote-Speaker präsentieren wird, lassen Sie uns noch beim Jahresthema des Berliner Antike-Kollegs verweilen. Ich möchte kurz aus den noch laufenden Projekten zum letzten Jahresthema Mitreden berichten, dann das neue Jahresthema mit Konflikten umgehen einführen, indem ich die insgesamt 4 aus den Einsendungen zur Ausschreibung ausgewählten Proposals dazu vorstelle und zuletzt einen kurzen Blick auf BAK-Aktivitäten der nächsten Zeit werfen. Das Jahresthema 2022 Mitreden, das wir vor fast genau einem Jahr an diesem Ort proklamiert haben, war der Transdisziplinarität, dem Geben und Nehmen zwischen Wissenschaft und Gesellschaft gewidmet und sollte die Tragweite der Programmatik für die Altertumswissenschaften erkunden. Einige hier erinnern sich zweifellos an Gesine Schwans engagiertes Plädoyer für Transdisziplinarität als einer Praxis der offenen Gesellschaft und zur Stärkung der Demokratie. Was ist aus den 4 vor einem Jahr an den Start gegangenen Projekten geworden? Unter der Maßgabe, dass ihre Laufzeit noch andauert, gebe ich hier eine kurze Zwischenbilanz. Das Akademievorhaben Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum hatte unter dem Titel Before They Are Lost Forever eine kollaborative Open-Access-Plattform für private Fotografien lateinischer Inschriften konzipiert. Im Laufe des Jahres haben die Protagonisten sich weithin vernetzt und hunderte Dias gescannt und bearbeitet, von denen auch die Arbeit des Akademievorhabens profitierte. Eine Kooperation zwischen Archäologie, Rehabilitationstechnik und außeruniversitären Initiativen und Vereinen hatte sich barrierearme Wissenschaftskommunikation in der Archäologie auf die Fahne geschrieben. Für eine digitale Ausstellung zur Ramsesstadt wurden Applikationen der Inklusion, Barrierefreiheit, sozialen Plattformunabhängigkeit entwickelt. So konzipierten Studierende in einer Lehrveranstaltung Audioguide-Texte, die wiederum von RehabilitationswissenschaftlerInnen sprachlich in Gebärdensprache und medial in Videoguides übersetzt werden. Eine Projektinitiative des Ägyptischen Museums hat unter dem Titel Kulturgut schützen in Kooperation mit Staatsanwaltschaften und Ermittlungsbehörden ein Vademekum zum Kulturgutschutz entwickelt und einen Workshop dazu veranstaltet. Dem Anliegen des Kulturschutzes widmet sich auch ein Projekt zur digitalen Weiterentwicklung des analogen Spiels Task Force Saving Antiquities und seiner Einführung in die Gamer-Szene. Hier wurde in Kooperation mit dem Projekt Board Game Historian der Universität Münster ein Leitfaden zur Fallentwicklung im Videospielformat konzipiert. Unter dem Titel Active Voices, wir reden mit, entstand außerdem im Rahmen des Jahresthemas Mitreden ein Podcast über Transdisziplinarität und Partizipation in den Altertumswissenschaften. Diese Gespräche mit Christoph Kümmel von der DFG, mit dem Wissenschaftskommunikationsforscher Philipp Schlögel, mit den Ägyptologinnen Heba Abdel-Gawad und Alice Stevenson, mit Leslie Khan, dem Direktor des Knowledge Equity Lab der University Toronto, Scarborough und mit dem vorderorientalischen Archäologen Reinhold Bernbeck. Diese Gespräche können Sie auf dem Berliner Antiquity-Blog oder eben auf YouTube hören. Das Jahresthema 2023-24, dessen Launch uns heute zusammenführt, lautet mit Konflikten umgehen. Varia lectio, Konflikte umgehen. Es möchte die Erforschung von Konfliktkonstellationen und Strategien der Austragung, der Bewältigung oder Vermeidung von Konflikten ins Forum gemeinsamen Nachdenkens stellen. Die für Affiliierte der 6 BAK-Institutionen offene Jahresthema-Ausschreibung generierte Projektanträge, aus denen wieder 4 ausgewählt worden sind. Und die möchte ich Ihnen noch kurz vorstellen. Privatdozentin Dr. Ulrike Emich von der Berliner Akademie war erfolgreich mit ihrem Proposal Wenn Waffen sprechen, Inschriftentexte auf Waffen als performative Botschaften. In diesem Projekt soll ein Archivbestand von rund 1000 römischen Schleuterbleiabdrücken mit ihren zynischen Botschaften an ihre Opfer digital aufgearbeitet und durch einen interdisziplinären Workshop in eine transeuropäische, diachrone komparatistische Perspektive gestellt werden. Welche Intentionen verbanden oder welche konfliktzuspitzende oder Ventilwirkung erzielten die schadenfrohen Botschafter mit verbalen Verhöhnungen ihrer Feinde? Soziologische und psychologische Ansätze sollen dabei helfen, universelle oder situationsspezifische Mechanismen zu identifizieren. Die Prähistorikerinnen Dr. Ilja Haidt, Eurasia-Abteilung des DAI, und Dr. Jana Eger, Freie Universität, beantragten erfolgreich das Projekt Fight or Flight, The Archaeology of Space, Mobility and Violence. Welche Bedeutung hatten Raum und Mobilität für Konflikte, für die Handlungsalternativen Gewaltanwendung versus Deeskalation? Ist das Ausweichen im Raum eine historische Strategie der Konfliktvermeidung? und hat die Antwort auf diese Frage Konsequenzen für unsere Vorstellung früher Gesellschaften? Dieses Projekt wird eine mehrtägige internationale Konferenz veranstalten und dabei sollen nicht allein Archäologien unterschiedlicher Zeiten und Räume, sondern auch die soziologische und politikwissenschaftliche Konfliktforschung ins Gespräch miteinander treten. Die Protagonistinnen schreiben, as the topic often provokes grand historical narratives, we believe each side can benefit from inter- and even transdisciplinary communication on this complex social-political matter. Professorin Elke Kaiser, Freie Universität, beantragte erfolgreich das Projekt Bedrohung aus dem Osten, der eurasische Steppenraum als Konfliktreservoir und Innovationsmotor. Dieses Projekt möchte aus geänderter Perspektive den historischen Plot des Konflikts zwischen kriegerischen Reiternomaden und friedlichen, sesshaften Ackerbauern reevaluieren und alternative Deutungen von Interaktionen und Wissenstransfer zwischen scheinbar gegensätzlich organisierten Gesellschaften entwickeln. Dabei soll der Rolle der Frauen eine besondere Aufmerksamkeit zukommen. Ein im März 2024 geplanter internationaler Workshop soll das durch aktuelle naturwissenschaftliche Erkenntnisse und politische Entwicklungen immer wieder revitalisierte Narrativ des Clash of Cultures kritisch kommentieren und nach gewaltlosen Austauschformaten fragen. Privatdozentin Dr. Daria Sterbens-Erker, Humboldt-Universität, hat die Auswahlkommission mit ihrem Projektvorschlag Konflikte und religiös-politische Konfliktlösungen in der griechisch-römischen Welt überzeugt. Dieses Projekt wird eine inter- und transdisziplinäre Forscherinnengruppe zum Thema installieren, in der wissenschaftliche Expertise aus der klassischen Philologie, Medizingeschichte und Altengeschichte, Mediävistik, Religionswissenschaft, Sozial- und Politikwissenschaft und aus dem Zentrum für interdisziplinäre Friedens- und Konfliktforschung der Freien Universität Berlin vertreten ist. Auch außerakademische Expertise, wie etwa die von Polizeibeamten, soll gehört werden. So sollen theoretisch fundiert antike Quellenbefunde von Konflikten zwischen politischen Parteien, Individuen, Gemeinschaften und religiösen Gruppen unter Sozial-, Politik- und religionswissenschaftlichen Aspekten ausgelotet werden. Die Arbeit der Gruppe wird in einer internationalen Konferenz münden. Der Auswahlkommission gefiel der interinstitutionelle Verbundcharakter des Projekts und seine explizite Ausrichtung auf größere, spätere Nachfolgeprojekte. In den Jahresthema-Projekten dieses Jahres sind also dieses Mal 4 der 6 WAC-Institutionen vertreten. Alle 4 Projekte projizieren international besetzte, interdisziplinär konstituierte Konferenzen. Diese 4 auf je verschiedene Art im Jahresthema verankerten Veranstaltungen werden sich im Frühjahr 2024 zu einem imposanten Reigen choreografieren, sich gegenseitig kommentieren und ergänzen. Sie können von Studierenden der Universitäten und Promovierenden der Bergsas studiert und teilweise auch von öffentlichem Publikum erlebt werden. Seien Sie also mit uns gespannt auf das Frühjahr 2024 im Zeichen der antiken Konfliktforschung. Wir werden Sie in jedem Falle darüber auf dem Laufenden halten. Den 4 Projekten ist auch gemeinsam, und dies war in der Tat insinuiert durch den Ausschreibungstext, dass der Sozial- und Politikwissenschaft und der Konfliktforschung besondere Prominenz im Konzert interdisziplinärer Verschränkungen zukommen soll. Das bringt mich zu einem abschließenden Punkt, dem Ausblick auf nächste WAC-Aktivitäten. Wie Sie wissen und gutieren, lässt das Berliner Antike-Kolleg sich die Pflege der Kooperation zwischen Fächern und Institutionen der Berliner Altertumswissenschaften angelegen sein, die in ihrer Fächerdichte und Breite, ihren institutionellen Infrastrukturen, ihrer Fülle an Museen, Sammlungen und Repositorien, singuläre Massierung altertumswissenschaftlicher Kompetenz in Berlin bildet ein Potenzial, welches, um als solches zur Entfaltung zu kommen, zusammengedacht, gebündelt und strategisch eingesetzt werden muss. Das ist die erklärte Absicht des BAK. Eines seiner konkreten Ziele ist die Beantragung von Verbundforschungsprojekten. Und zu Recht bemessen die 6 BAK-Institutionen, namentlich die Universitäten als die Hauptförderer des BAK, seinen Erfolg auch daran. Wie sicherlich viele von Ihnen wissen, ist die Clusterinitiative unter dem Titel Bricolage kurz vor offizieller Absichtserklärung der Freien und Humboldt-Universität durch sachfremde, akzidentielle Umstände gestoppt worden. Schade, weil sie gerade zuletzt einen guten Drive aufzunehmen begann. Die intellektuelle Dynamik verdankte sich nicht zuletzt dem interdisziplinären Brückenschlag mit der historischen Soziologie, wie sie an der Technischen Universität, namentlich durch Professorin Nina Bauer, verankert ist. In der Tat ist uns aus diesem Bereich ein über die Clusterinitiative hinausreichendes Interesse an Zusammenarbeit signalisiert worden. Und ich freue mich daher, dass Kollege Hubert Knoblauch heute die Soziologie der Technischen Universität hier vertritt, da Kollegin Bauer, die gerne gekommen wäre, verhindert ist. Der fachliche Konnex, aber auch eine stärkere institutionelle Allianz mit der Technischen Universität, in deren historischer Bauforschung und Kunstgeschichte ebenfalls Interesse an Kooperation mit den Altertumswissenschaften besteht, sind eine für die Entwicklung des Berliner Antike-Kollegs sehr interessante Perspektive. Schließlich ist ja das BAK im Kleinen schon seit längerem für die Altertumswissenschaften das gewesen, als was im Großen und ohne fachliche Limitierung 2018 die Berlin University Alliance ins Leben gerufen worden ist. Ein Katalysator der Synergieentfaltung. Ich möchte auch heute schon Ihre Aufmerksamkeit auf ein neues Format richten, das wir im Laufe dieses Jahres starten werden. Eine Serie von Impulsvorträgen und Podiumsgesprächen mit international renommierten Kolleginnen und Kollegen, Issues in Ancient Studies. Auch von diesem Format sollen und werden Studierende und Promovierende auf spezielle Weise profitieren können. So viel zu den aktuellen Entwicklungen im Berliner Antike-Kolleg. Ich möchte diese Gelegenheit jetzt nutzen, unter Anbetracht dessen, dass das Jahresthema, seine Vorbereitung, Austragung, Abwicklung sehr viel Arbeit verursacht. Die Köpfe und Hände unseres Antike-Kollegs mit Dank bedenken. Sie würdigen unsere Geschäftsführerin Henrike Simon, unsere Koordinatorin Birgit Nennstiel, speziell auch für das Jahresthema Friederike Herklotz, und ich möchte die Gelegenheit nutzen, diesen hilfreichen Personen einen Applaus hier zu generieren. Ich danke Ihnen und ich übergebe jetzt das Wort an Philipp von Rummel, der uns den Meister des Abends vorstellt. Lieber Philipp.
Vielen Dank, lieber Sebastian. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, ich freue mich sehr, Ihnen jetzt den Redner des heutigen Abends vorstellen zu dürfen. Herrn Professor David Nirenberg, Direktor des Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, der bereits über verschiedene Wege mit Berlin verbunden ist und hier auch wohl bekannt ist. Und daher freue ich mich besonders, lieber Herr Nirenberg, Sie heute hier Abend begrüßen zu dürfen in der James-Simon-Galerie. David Nirenberg studierte von 1982 bis 1986 an der Yale-Universität, wechselte dann an die Princeton University und schloss dort 1992 mit der Promotion ab. Im gleichen Jahr wechselte er als Professor an die Rice University in Houston und im Jahr 2000 an die Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, wo er auch das Stallman Center for Jewish Studies gründete. 2006 folgte er einem Ruf an die University of Chicago, wo er bis in das letzte Jahr in vielen unterschiedlichen Funktionen tätig war. Als Deborah and Edgar Janotta Distinguished Service Professor of Social Thought and History, als Gründungsdirektor des Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society und als Dekan der Sozialwissenschaftlichen Fakultät. In dieser Funktion war er auch federführend an der Formierung des Studiengangs für Computational Social Science beteiligt und an der Gründung des Zentrums für internationale sozialwissenschaftliche Forschung. Seit 2022, also seit dem letzten Jahr, ist er nun Direktor des berühmten Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. Sie sehen also schon, dass David Nirenberg ein idealer Redner ist für die Auftaktveranstaltung zum Jahresthema 2023-24 des Berliner Antike-Kollegs. Seine zahlreichen und vielfältigen Publikationen unterstreichen das umso mehr. Lassen Sie mich nur kurz auf die Monographien eingehen. Schon sein 1996 erschienenes Buch Communities of Violence, Persecution of Minorities in the Middle Ages bewegte sich im Zentrum des neuen Jahresthemas. Er untersucht dort am Beispiel von Frankreich und Aragon im 14. Jahrhundert das Konzept der Gewalt gegen Minderheiten im Mittelalter und zeigt, dass diese Angriffe, die von Massakern bis hin zu verbalen Angriffen gegen Juden, Muslime, Leprakranke und Prostituierte reichen, oft nicht von irrationalen Massen verübt wurden, sondern von spezifischen Gruppen, die die verfügbaren Diskurse über Minderheiten manipulierten und umgestalteten. Das sehr einflussreiche Buch Anti-Judaism, The Western Tradition von 2013, das auch in deutscher Übersetzung vorliegt, spannt einen weiten Bogen vom antiken Ägypten bis ins 20. Jahrhundert und beschreibt den Antijudaismus als Denkkonzept, als epistemisches Muster, das der westlichen Weltdeutung zugrunde liegt. Neighboring Faith, Christianity, Islam and Judaism, Medieval and Modern von 2014 stellt die häufig separat erzählte Geschichte von Juden, Christen und Muslimen als eine eng verwobene, mit stetiger gegenseitiger Beeinflussung dar, mit dem Ziel, die verflochtene Vergangenheit der drei Religionen zu verstehen, nicht zuletzt auch, um die Zukunft positiv gemeinsam gestalten zu können. Er ist gemeinsam mit seinem Vater Ricardo Nirenberg zudem Autor von Accountable, A Philosophical History of Number and Humanity from Antiquity to the Present von 2021, in dem es darum geht, die Möglichkeiten und Grenzen der Natur- und Geisteswissenschaften zu verstehen. Für seine Arbeiten hat David Nirenberg viele Preise und Auszeichnungen erhalten, darunter den Historikerpreis der Stadt Münster, den Lang-Preis der University of Chicago Press oder die Ehrendoktorwürde der University of Haifa. Und auch Berlin findet sich in seinem Werdegang immer wieder. 2004-05 war er Fellow des Wissenschaftskollegs zu Berlin. Er ist Mitglied des Advisory Board des Einstein Center Kronoi und seit diesem Jahr auch, und darüber sind wir besonders froh, Mitglied des Wissenschaftlichen Beirates des Berliner Antike-Kollegs. Dafür sind wir Ihnen, lieber Professor Nirenberg, ganz besonders dankbar, genau wie wir auch dankbar sind, dass Sie heute Abend zu uns gekommen sind. Wir freuen uns sehr auf Ihren Vortrag Poisonous Politics, Community and Conflict from the Ancient World to the Present und geben Ihnen das Wort, sind sehr gespannt auf Ihren Vortrag.
Thank you for this beautiful introduction. And I am I'm very embarrassed that I must speak in English. I'm also embarrassed that I'm not an ancient historian. It's a great honor to be here to open this Jahresthema, but it would be better if I knew more about the ancient world. So I've decided to try a trick. I thought I would it's not a topic I've been working on recently. Recently I've been working on race and religion, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. But since Christianity and Islam didn't really exist in the ancient world, I thought I should bring something else. So I chose a topic that I worked on 30 years ago but never did anything with. I started it with Peter Brown when I was Peter Brown's student, and so it came as close to the ancient world as I could imagine. And that is, although Peter Brown is not, late antiquity. And that topic is poison. And what I want to try claim is that poison is a way of thinking about conflict and community that is very important in the Middle Ages, so I can say something about it, but that has very, very ancient, even ur-ancient roots, and that extends all the way into our present time. So I'd like to give you a sense of this long, long history as a way of holding together the Antike, the entire Vormoderne and the Moderne. But I do not mean to imply that the work poison does across this entire history is always the same. I just want to claim that there is something to be learned by noticing that the history is so long. So first, let me describe what I mean by poison. And if I don't seem as if I'm speaking to you, it's because I actually can't see you. The lights are very, very bright. Modern historians tend to draw a clear distinction between poison, which we treat as a real agent, and which historians by and large ignore, and magic, incantation, witchcraft, etc., which we consider irrational, unreal, and lavish historiographical attention upon. But in the ancient and medieval world, these were intimately related ways of thinking about how one person could act upon another at a distance and without visible intermediary. The section on poison that Plato includes in his Laws, for example, posits the relationship explicitly. Can you all see this? So then I won't always read the texts. I would leave you to read them because you read better than I do, and that way I don't overwhelm you with sound while you make your way through words much more weighty than mine. But you can see here that Plato makes the distinction, and he seems to suggest that if it were not for the reality of poison, people would not believe in magic. Now, Plato may believe magical models of causality are less rational than the pharmacologies upon which they're built, but he treats these ways of thinking as intimately related to one another, the magical and the pharmacological. It's on this, and this same double register is evident in later Roman law. Tam venenis quam susurris magicis. They're equivalent in the treatment of the law. So it is on emic grounds, then, that my category of poison is going to be more capacious than that of a modern physician. Second, although I will focus my talk today on poison and maybe politics, I don't mean to distinguish too sharply between conflicts in the political sphere and conflicts in other spheres of human activity. For example, the erotic. Think again of Plato reporting that Socrates claimed to be the son of a midwife. For midwives, Socrates said, do for the body what he does for the soul, with the drugs and incantations, venenis and susurris. Right? That's not his vocabulary, but again, they're together. So Plato is here drawing on a view of midwives, already ancient in his time, that they control the pharmacology of the erotic, a power that can be used for good or for ill, and that can even prove fatal to the target. Think of poor Hercules. The classical Latin word venenum, meaning drug, in the simultaneous sense of poison and medicine, was even thought by the ancients to be etymologically derived from Venus. Beyond love potions, women might poison their husbands out of desire for another. In the words of Cato the Elder, who is always good for a pithy saying, there is no adulteress who is not also a poisoner. So rabbinic and Christian commentary traditions sometimes elevated the poisonous feminine desire to a founding element of conflict in the human condition, understanding Eve's giving of the apple to Adam as her poisoning him, and through him all of mankind, out of sexual desire for the serpent. Thus, even though the author of Genesis, in chapter 3, verse 20, explains that she was called Chava because she was the mother of all living things, Chaya in Hebrew, a rival etymology was very popular, both in the ancient world and among some modern comparative linguists. Chava came from serpent, cognate with the Arabic and Syriac chaya, Aramaic chivya. Clement of Alexandria introduces the etymology to the early Christian church, presenting Eve as both poisoner and adulteress. Now, an entire history could be written about that tradition alone. But here I want to use that tradition to make a final caveat. The ambivalence of communication represented through poisonous figures is not restricted to human-human relations. So here you just saw it apply to human-animal relations, right? Eve, serpent. And it also affects relations between humans and gods as well. As the Muses put it at the beginning of Hesiod's Theogony, we know how to tell many false things that are like truths, and we know whenever we want how to sing out truths. So they said, the accurate speaking daughters of mighty Zeus. And the Israelite God, too, sends true prophets, but also dreamers and false prophets, equipped with signs, wonders, and strong delusions to put his people to the test. Think Deuteronomy chapter 13 and Thessalonians chapter 2. In one very unsettling passage from Ezekiel, which is one of my favorites, God even suggests that the scriptures he has given contain, quote, ordinances that were not good and statutes whereby they should not live. So it's not an often quoted chapter of Ezekiel, but it's a great one. These anxieties about human-divine communication were also productive of poisonous concepts. One of these concepts, I'm trying to expand the concept of poison here to include many other aspects of our social lives and our epistemological lives. One of these concepts is hypocrisy, a lethal form of resistance to divine teaching. So far as I know, despite the divine capacity for deceit, despite the fact that gods can lie to people, only humans are accused of hypocrisy. In archaic Greek myth, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran alike, hypocrisy serves as a key ontological concept repeatedly deployed to explain the confusions of the world. I think here of this passage, Achilles' complaint about Odysseus in the Iliad, or of Psalm 5 or Psalm 78, of Isaiah's woes of the hypocrites who drag guilt along by the reins of duplicity, and of Jesus' woes of the Pharisees. And of course, while you read this, I'll just add the Quran's repeated condemnation of the munafiqun and the nifaq, the hypocrites. In fact, I should offer a trigger warning here. I'm going to show an image of Muhammad. I don't apologize for that, but I do want to alert you to that. And here you have Muhammad viewing the hypocrites in hell. Words, too, have their fates. Hypocrisy, from archaic Attic, decision beneath the surface, came to be associated with a false, death-dealing, and poisonous relationship to communicative media. Think in the New Testament, the letter kills, but I'm going to speak much more about poison and hypocrisy in the medieval period. Whereas a Greek word similarly laden with ambivalence, namely allegory, literally others speak, was associated with truth and salvation. I think we could write an entire history of sectarian formation in the polarized field between these two terms of communicative ambivalence. But how can we tell what is salvific allegory and what is deadly hypocrisy? This question produced yet another ancient use of poison as a diagnostic of true prophecy. I think here of 2 Kings, chapter 4, in which the prophet Elisha detects poison in a stew and renders it harmless, or of the early tradition about the life of Muhammad, in which the prophet Muhammad detects with one bite the poison in a stew prepared for him by a Jewess, or of Jesus' last words to the apostles in the Gospel of Mark. I'll pause while you read this really interesting passage. So the signs here, the driving out of demons, speaking in tongues, picking up snakes with their hands, which has something to do with poison. And when they drink a deadly thing, it will not hurt them at all. And then, of course, healing. Every one of the signs of onto-theological certainty offered by Jesus in this passage has a long future. But let's focus on immunity to deadly drinks, which became a sanctity in Christianity, attributed to John the Evangelist, to Benedict of Nursia, and Sabinus of Canossa, and many others. By the Middle Ages, the poisoned chalice had become a sign to designate John in sculptural programs, much as a blindfold designated synagoga. More importantly, mortifera, deadly poisons, came to represent the dangers of scriptural language itself. Stay with me, this one, it may seem far-fetched, but it's true. I give you here Irenaeus of Lyon, a very early theorist of the problem. Error is plausible and bears a resemblance to the truth, but requires to be disguised. And here's where poison becomes the metaphor for understanding the ambivalent meaning of scriptural passages, which can lead both to truth and to deadly error. Just as if one giving lime mixed with water for milk should be misled by the similitude of the color. After all, to jump to a slightly later figure, Augustine, what else are hearing and reading and depositing things in the memory than several processes of drinking? The Lord, however, foretold, and here he cites Mark, that his faithful followers, even if they should drink any deadly thing, it should not hurt him. So here, in the passages I've just given you, poison is offered as a solution, I guess I should say pardon the pun, but as a solution to a basic problem affecting the media of divine revelation. Here's the basic problem from the words of Vincent Oléran. If the words, the sentiments, the promises of Scripture are appealed to by the devil and his disciples, what are Catholics and the sons of Mother Church to do? How are they to distinguish truth from falsehood in the sacred Scriptures? The answer I've been giving you so far by citing these church fathers is drink poison. It's through poison that these texts assert confidence in the difference between truth and falsity can be tested in the world. And let me give you a list, an abbreviated list of saints who did this. David of Wales, Patrick of Ireland, George of Cappadocia, Samson of Dol, Ethelwold of Winchester, William of York, and then the spider-drinking saints. There were spider-drinking saints like Norbert of Chanten, founder of the order of the Premonstratensians. And those are only a few of the many poison-verified saints in medieval hagiography. I confess I don't find these saints very attractive, perhaps because they're being deployed to achieve what I think is unachievable, namely the elimination of interpretive conflict. The effort to cleave the ambivalence of communication that interests me. I'm interested in the ambivalence of communication, in the inability to separate conflict and concord. So let me abandon all this background and all this caveat and try to offer a sense of that profound ambivalence that poison represents about conflict and concord in every act of communication and community, beginning with an example from the Indo-European, see, I'm going to get uralt, vocabulary of political community and communication. In his Gift and Exchange in the Indo-European vocabulary, Émile Benveniste explored two Indo-European roots for gift. Do, give or receive, and me, a root for gift with added implications of contract. He explored some of the implications of this second root through Latin munus, consisting of me plus the Indo-European suffix nes, which he said was attached to designations of a social or judicial nature. For example, Latin pignus, fenus, funus, facinus. Munus means gift, of course, but it also means many other things, including function, office, obligation, task, favor, public spectacle, and Festus's definition, a donum quod officii causa datur, so a gift given because of office. Benveniste says, the word contains the double value of a political charge conferred as a distinction and of donations imposed in return. Here is the basis of community, he says, since communis signifies literally one who shares in the munia or munera. Benveniste did not say, perhaps because it seemed too obvious, that here too was the basis of communicatio, a making common, imparting, communicating. Nor did he mention immunus, that is, exempt from political office or taxation, not partaking in, not giving gifts, and more generally, immune to sadness, disease, impurity, poison, etc. So a semantic connection clearly exists in Indo-European between communication, politics, and gift. But what about poison? Benveniste was silent on the topic, though the roots me and do contain traces of the association. Beside immunity, think also of words like dose and antidote. The association is even stronger in Germanic languages, where, as many have observed, gift has ambivalent meanings ranging from Geschenk, right, present, to poison. I'm not going to talk about Marcel Maus's famous hypothesis that fears of the gift's communicative ambivalence, of its capacity to conceal deceit, as well as to impose hierarchies and obligations, were expressed through poison. I would like to broaden that statement. It's not just the gift whose dangers are represented through poison, but those of every form of communicative exchange. So consider just two examples. The first is that of language itself. While straight, plain, or true language was characterized by positive metaphors such as medicine, gold, or treasure, as in the modern German word for dictionary, Wortschatz, deceiving language was mapped directly onto poison. In the Gorgias, for example, Socrates equated rhetoric with drugs, incantations, and snake charming. Indeed, the Socratic dialogues reveal a profound discomfort with language, a sense that the communications it enables can never be fully transparent. Letters themselves, in the myth of origin that Plato tells, were made by Thoth out of writhing snakes. It's this ambivalence that Derrida elevated into a theory of language in his well-known essay, Plato's Pharmacy, whose central example was the double meaning of the Greek word pharmakon. And later I'll give you 15th century examples of thinkers making the same point. My second example of a communicative exchange whose dangers are represented through poison is that of marriage. Lévi-Strauss described the exchange of brides as the, quote, the conclusion to an uninterrupted process of reciprocal gifts which affects the transition from hostility to alliance, from anxiety to confidence, and from fear to friendship. So for Claude Lévi-Strauss, marriage takes us from conflict to concord. But this confidence is vastly exaggerated, at least if we're talking of many Indo-European societies, not to speak of many marriages. We find the treacherous do root in words like dowry, Morgengabe. The word for marriage itself is a warning, for gift, means marriage in Anglo-Saxon, Swedish, Dano-Norwegian, and Old Icelandic. And in most of these, except perhaps Old Icelandic, it means poison as well. It should be no surprise, given this linguistic heritage, that the exchange of brides, far from confident, is among the most venomous, deceitful, and conflict-provoking of all. So these examples could be multiplied to include many other forms of a communication and exchange. But more is not required for the very general point I've been trying to make thus far. In many societies, communicative exchange is imagined as profoundly ambivalent, as capable of deceit as of revelation, of producing both conflict and concord. And this ambivalence is often represented in terms of poison. As a corollary to this, persons imagined as specialists in the manipulation of communicative action are often represented as poisonous. Socrates' rhetoricians, women, and Jews. Each of these associations deserves its own history. So far I've mentioned that there's like 5 histories I'd like to write, and I have written none of them. But today I'll push in a different direction, that of using poison as an entry to thinking about conflict in political community and communication. And now I'm going to switch to the Middle Ages, something I actually know a little about. I want to suggest that communicative acts claiming to establish or to represent political order in the Middle Ages were embedded in the ambivalences I've described. Their potential could be understood as at least dual, as ordering and disordering, producing conflict or peace, representing and misrepresenting, an ambivalence often expressed in the language of poison. I think that listening to that language may inspire us to rethink some of our anthropologically inflected assumptions about the nature of medieval political communication, community, and ritual. Not surprisingly, the palaces of princes turn out to be especially toxic places. What is curious is that despite a century of study dedicated to princely communicative strategies and rituals by historians, what royal action, from dining to toilet, does not have its historian? The poisonous face of these communicative exchanges is seldom seen. In fact, Mark Bloch, the founder of the Annales School, in his famous study of the royal touch, explicitly denied the possibility of a negative aspect to that ritual. So today I'd like to stare more directly at the deadly side of political communication, moving quickly from Germanic war bands to the early modern court societies of Norbert Elias, and I'll conclude with just a few words about computers and the present. As an epic tale of a hero's encounter with monsters, the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf is somewhat frustrating, interrupted by endless stories of gift, marriage, feuds, and rituals that some scholars of the poem have called the digressions. That frustration disappears if we notice that from its opening lines describing the founding of the throne of Denmark by Scyld Scefing, all the way to the burial of Beowulf at its conclusion, the entirety of the poem is concerned with the strategies of communication and exchange available to build societies to those who would rule. Even the poem's monsters are only extreme examples of all too human failings in the matter of exchange. Grendel, for example, is too implacable in feud. The dragon is too avaricious. In this sense, Beowulf may be said to present us with an exquisitely detailed analysis of the politics of communication and exchange in a Germanic war band. And that analysis turns out to be thoroughly ambivalent. There is no personage in the poem, no piece of advice, no matter how exemplary, no form of exchange which is not at the same time shown to fail disastrously. Whatever the virtues of Hrothgar and Beowulf, both their kingdoms are destroyed. Wealhtheow's many graces, the queen, cannot save her children from massacre. Whenever advice on good kingship is explicitly given in the poem, it's also explicitly shown to be inadequate. After Beowulf's victory, for example, Hrothgar admonishes the hero to be ever generous in gifts to his war bands, so that his followers not abandon him when his own arms weaken in strength with age. Beowulf is generous, but he's nevertheless abandoned in his final fight. Back home, Beowulf tells his own king about Hrothgar's plan to settle a feud with the king of the Hjarthabards by giving them his daughter Freyawaru in marriage as a peace weaver, a Freyolthulvebe. But, he says, seldom anywhere after a slaying will the death spear rest even for a while, though the bride be good. Even the smallest gift may bring about disaster. The miserable exile who gives to his lord the cup he stole from the dragon wins back his lord's protection only to awaken a new strife far more dangerous, and also to lay grounds for the writing of The Hobbit. There is, in short, no form of communication, no exchange, however precious, which cannot go astray. Dangerous as exchange is in Beowulf, it's not openly poisonous. What poison there is in the poem tends to pool around dragons and their hordes, because gold that doesn't circulate becomes unhealthy. But if we look closely at the most ritualized and courtly moments in the poem, we can glimpse once again the poison face of communication. Consider this passage. Whoops. I meant to show you Benveniste, and somehow I missed it. I think I have, yeah. So it starts, you should read this part first. And then this. Wealhtheow came forward, Hrothgar's queen, mindful of courtesies. The noble lady gave the first cup, filled to the brim to the king of the Danes. The lady the Helmings walked through the hall, offered the jeweled cup to veterans and youths. Until the time came that the courteous queen, splendid in rings, excellent in virtues, came to Beowulf, brought him the mead. She greeted him well, gave thanks to God, wise in her words, that her wish came to pass, that she might expect help against crimes from any man. So the ritual described here, the queen's circulation of the mead cup amongst her husband's warriors in order of rank, can be found in many Indo-European and more specifically Germanic cultures. This function of queenship was represented even amongst the gods, as when in the Lokasena, Thor's wife Sif brings drink to Loki after he has insulted the gods, the idea being that the cup will restore concord. Archaeologists often find among the grave goods of noble women their tools of office, cups, a cauldron of mead at their feet, a miniature ladle at their belt. And the office is reflected in naming patterns as well. Many women bear the name of the cup, of the horn, of the beaker, or ale, mead, etc. The circulating cup had meant, ignore this, it's just holding space so you don't have to stare at the other word. It's 19th century, not interesting. The circulating cup had many functions. Oaths were taken over it, promises of fealty and promises of revenge were made, boasts were preferred of prowess in battle to come, and speeches were exchanged. In one sense, the lady with the mead cup acts as an extension of royal power, restoring harmony, renewing formality, rearticulating hierarchy, creating community. The cup's circulation in the queen's hand simultaneously, as one historian put it, creates coherence and establishes subordination. Whereas Wealhtheow herself puts it a bit later, when she seeks to prevent Beowulf's election as king, she says, the Thanes are united, a nation prepared. Our men having drunk will do as I ask. So like Queen Wealhtheow, many modern scholars, influenced by anthropology, stress the consensus-building efficacy and power of such rituals. But I think contemporaries understood that this confidence was misplaced. Hasn't the poet repeatedly hinted that murderous discord shivers just over the horizon? And the poet doesn't stop there, for like every example of communication in the poem, queenly courtesies must be paired with their negation. So when Beowulf returns home, we're introduced to his king, King Hygelac, and his queen, Queen Hygd, who was very young, wise, and courteous. The poem gives 5 lines to Hygd before attention shifts to another queen from a distant place and time. I'm not even going to try to pronounce Mathrithro's name, but Mathrithro, however, that mighty queen, did terrible crimes. Forgive the typo on the slide. Rather than weaving peace, she wove murderous intrigues, sharp shadow patterns of death, killing retainers at will. That's a quote from Beowulf. In Anglo-Saxon literature, this negative and poisonous type of queenship is as well attested as the positive. Ealbura, the daughter of Offa II, in Asser's Life of King Alfred, Quendrida, here, in the 13th century Latin Life of the Two Offas, who poisons Offa, her husband. Many a warband's leader and many a follower were said to have died of poison at the hands of their queen. It's in this context of grim, I'm going to call it grim conviviality, that the Old Norse Edda advises warriors to learn the recipes for brewing so as to be able to detect poison. You must know ale runes if you wish the wife of another not to deceive you in your trust when you feel secure. Very good advice. The wise queen and her poisonous counterpart were both complex figures, standing at the intersection of many questions. We could write many histories about them. But for today, it's enough if I've established 2 crude points. First, the mead ritual is a highly formalized and mannered representation of political community that plays an important role in establishing the order that it claims to represent. And second, the deceptive potential of this ceremonial communication, that is, its ability to conceal enmity in the guise of friendship, to mix conflict in the ale of concord, is articulated in terms of poison. This marriage between political communication and suspicion of poison will become even clearer in the courtly societies of the later Middle Ages. There's a debate about the origins of courtliness, but there's consensus about what it consists of: the domestication of aristocratic violence in the context of increasing royal power. This domestication didn't require the abdication of self-interest, but it stressed the cultivation of behaviors that concealed the competitive quest for power. Its ideal type was a figure like Gottfried von Strassburg's Tristan, skilled in all the arts of attaining advancement by pleasing a prince, but equally skilled in never seeming to be trying to do so. Castiglione would later coin the term sprezzatura for this competitive nonchalance. The ideal courtier conceals all artistry. True art is what does not seem to be art. Not only art, but also talent, ambition, self-interest, enmity, all of these were to be hidden behind what still later, in the 17th century, Jean de la Bruyère described as the courtier's smiling face. Given that courtliness requires a split between the outer and the inner, between seeming and being, sincerity and hypocrisy, we should expect it to be described in terms of poison. As the 12th century poet Johannes de Avila put it in his Prince of Lamentations, well, I won't read it to you, but you can see that here we have poison outing itself. The smiling face concealing poison, already a topos in misogynistic and anti-Jewish literature, became a central strand in 12th and 13th century critiques of court culture, such as John of Salisbury's Polycraticus or Walter Mapp's De Nugis Curialium. Poison could still be more broadly understood as the inevitable byproduct of the duplicity inherent in courtly communication, as in Herbert of Bosham's Life of St. Thomas a Becket. Anyone who fears the venom of court serpents must leave the court. This discourse of a poisoned court had the potential to animate powerful critiques of monarchy and of political life. Jean Gerson minced no words in Vivat Rex. Just as venom or poison kills the human body, tyranny is the venom and poison and disease that slays all political and royal life. And you can see there's an even more pungent metaphor from Guillaume de Tignonville. Ambrogio Lorenzetti's 14th century frescoes in the public palace of Siena made the point visually by representing the tyrant beneath the image of the devil holding a poisoned cup. Yeah, I hope you could see that. I'm just learning how to use this marvelous pointer. Critiques of poisonous politics might even go so far as to propose poisonous antidotes. John of Salisbury, speaking of Tiberius, opined that though veneficium, poisoning, is a horrible crime, in a political culture of tyranny like that of Rome, it could be considered healthy. He hastened to add, however, that of course such a thing could never happen in Britain. In short, poison and the distinctions it encoded, such as the distinction between appearance and reality, sincerity and hypocrisy, became critical tools in the comparative political theory of the medieval and early modern period. For example, the representation of the political culture of other nations as poisonous could serve as a powerful critique of one's own, even as it reinscribed differences claimed as vital. Since we're coming to a conclusion, I have time for only one example, so I'll pick a particularly self-conscious early modern play, John Webster's play The Duchess of Malfi, first performed in London in 1601. The setting is itself significant. Italy, Malfi, like much of the Mediterranean, had long been associated both with courtly duplicity and with poison in the northern imagination, and that includes the German imagination. English readers simultaneously devoured Italian handbooks for courtiers and denounced Italian courts as exemplars of corruption. Here is Thomas Nash, in The Unfortunate Traveler, on the educational values of visits to Italy. How does it form our young master? Well, it teaches him the art of whoring, the art of poisoning, the art of sodometry. The only good thing they have to keep us from utterly condemning it is that it makes a man an excellent courtier, which is to say a glorious hypocrite. All these courtly Italian vices were distilled by English authors into figures of poison, with Machiavelli their apothecary in chief. Into the 19th century, to say Machiavel, or even to say Italian in English letters, was to say politician, hypocrite, and poisoner in one word. It's in this context that Delio and Antonio stride onto the stage in Act 1, Scene 1 of The Duchess of Malfi, and their opening words immediately mark the play's concerns with what we might call comparative politics. Now, you've just been to France and to the French court. What did you think? Oh, I admire it. In seeking to reduce both state and people to a fixed order, their judicious king begins at home. And now comes the metaphor of poison and purity. So the political problem here is posed in terms of communication. A sycophantic court leads to the death of the kingdom, whereas sincere counsel in court leads to blessed government. Sounds nice. We just have to separate the two. The playwright's choice of poison as the governing metaphor is here not accidental. Webster's genius lies not in the originality of his theme, but in its extreme. Every corner of the court at Malfi in his play is poisoned. Every form of communication is death-dealing. Even the most tragic characters that are moved by love rather than ambition must dissimulate. Their public face, like every face in this play, is miscommunicative. Words, it is said, are never sincere. They're always poisoned pills wrapped in gold and sugar. Even the most sacred oath in the play is meant as a deception. But the deceiver herself is deceived when the Bible that she swears upon turns out to be poisonous. She kisses the Bible and promptly dies. In this inscrutable and corrupt world, communication has become so impossibly lethal that by the end of the play, only one character survives. Some have attempted to place this play within a specific context of political conflict and attributed it to a particular message. For example, many scholars claim it's about the struggle of the gentry to find their way in courts dominated by aristocrats in the early 17th century England. My goal is a simpler one, of stressing the ways in which Webster uses poison as a way of representing the dangers of communication within a society whose ontological, psychological, and political foundations were built upon a disjuncture between hypocrisy and sincerity. Okay, so thus far, I've suggested that in the pre-modern, the whole length of the pre-modern, from the Indo-European up to 1601, poison was used to represent the dangerous and disordering, conflict-producing side of communication. That courts were a locus of heightened concern about the nature of political communication, and third, that one subset of these dangers was often explored through the metaphor of poison. Now I just want to suggest that our modern critical vocabularies are not as far removed from these pre-modern concerns as we might think. Consider the case of Norbert Elias, who suggested that the requirements of court life transformed communicative action and posited the emergence of a culture of manners, ceremony, and etiquette that amounted to nothing less than a new form of subjectivity, which he famously described in The Court Society and in The Civilizing Process. So here I quote from The Civilizing Process, speaking of the courtier. Just as he is forced to seek the true motives of others behind their controlled outward behavior, well, I won't read it to you. You can see that it sounds very, very much like John of Salisbury or any one of our medieval critics about courtly duplicity. It's in court, according to Elias, that the superego is born, a peculiar form of civilized artifice that seeps unperceived into minds and limbs, first the minds and limbs of an emasculated court aristocracy, and then of the bourgeoisie who ape it. So notice how similar Elias's project is to that of the medieval observers I've mentioned. He claimed to be providing an account of the historical development of medieval and early modern court society, but in fact, he was recreating the critical discourses that those same societies used to make sense of themselves. The comparative politics of his Über den Prozess der Zivilisation follows a similar logic to that of John of Salisbury or John Webster. He sought to document an evolving distinction between civilization, by which he meant merely external refinement that masked corrupt inner realities, and Kultur, a thorough refinement of spirit to which external behavior is secondary. And that distinction will be familiar to everyone in this room, or at least to anyone who has read Thomas Mann's Betrachtungen eines Unpolitischen of 1918, or any of the many works produced by Germans in the decades on either side of World War I that made a similar point. French and English moral ideals, according to Elias, were derived from their culture of court elites. Their civilization was therefore external, behavioral, hypocritical. German morality, on the other hand, was born out of a tradition of opposition to court culture, so that German Kultur was more internal, less artificial than French or English civilization. Like many others, Elias understood World War I and the particular form of German cultural nationalism that followed it, as products of this split. He says, Europe was engaged in a war waged against Germany in the name of civilization. His book, published in 1939, was meant both as an explanation of this struggle and as an indictment of civilization in the terms I've been describing, in terms of poison. Elias subscribed entirely to the essential oppositions that had animated the medieval courtly critical discourse of poison. As he put it in The Civilizing Process, England and Germany, here he's quoting Theodore Fontane, England and Germany are related in the same way as form and content, appearance and reality. The German lives in order to live, the Englishman to represent. It's a shame that Elias never paid attention to the discourse of poison, for poison may itself be the best antidote to the dangerous tendency so common among intellectuals of the early 20th century and again in our own days that seduced him here, the tendency to over-polarize fundamentally ambivalent ontological distinctions such as conflict and concord. It's true, of course, that many medieval critics, like the theologians with whom I began, did treat poison as a negative distillation of hypocrisy and deceit. But it was a great virtue of pre-modern poison that it resisted such a reduction. Poison always contained both potentials, communicative and healing, miscommunicative and deadly, and could not be purged of either. Morally, as St. Augustine put it when arguing the non-existence of absolute evil, the valence of poison is relative. From the perspective of the scorpion, it's life-saving. From the perspective of the man stung, it is death. Physically, within a cosmos in which health was often thought to depend upon the balance of opposites, the effect of poison, killing or medicinal, depended upon the state of the system into which it was ingested. Contraria contrariis was the famous Hippocratic formula. Opposites cure opposites. Every poison is also a medicine, wrote the famous 14th century physician Arnaud de Villanova. In poison, there is physic, says Shakespeare. And here I give you a Medici courtier's version of Plato's Pharmakon. Of Derrida's Pharmakon. Thus, the hypocrisy and poison of the court could even become politically medicinal, as we see in the life of the famous courtier saint. And I think, in the interest of time, I'll skip these parts and simply say that I've been flirting with two broad claims. One is that with changes in the organization of political community come changes in the shape of how truth and falsity, hypocrisy and sincerity are imagined, and that imagination often takes the shape of rhetorics about poison. The other point, very general point, is that with changes in media come changes in anxieties about communication, and those anxieties also often take poisonous shape. So far, I've stuck resolutely to pre-modernity and avoided modernity. But I do want to just gesture towards the present to give us a sense of how these ideas persist. So when Tocqueville, for example, left the shattered court societies of France to write about the new American Republic, he noted that this new political community required new forms of sociability. In a world without an aristocracy, one has to smile at everyone else, since no one ever knows who one might depend on in the future. Goethe said something similar about the bourgeoisie. He opposed them to the aristocracy. The aristocracy could afford to be sincere because in their power they don't have to pretend to anyone, whereas the bourgeoisie, who are always depending on commercial relations, have to smile at everyone. So for Tocqueville and for Goethe, it's democracy and market economies rather than court hierarchy that produce the courtly, the hypocritical smiling face. Can we imagine a history of communicative conflict and concord that moves from Tocqueville's observations about manners in the new anti-court society to the American critic Lionel Trilling's sincerity and authenticity, or to the American political scientist Richard Hofstadter's wonderful essay on the paranoid style in American politics? So that would be yet another history that would take us into my land and its peculiar cultures. As for media, modernity has brought transformation after transformation, occasionally stimulating poisonous analogies. The internet and its dangers, for example, have plunged us back into a mosh pit of Indo-European archetypes of circulation and exchange. Think Trojan horses, viruses, worms. The metaphors through which we express the dangers of communication in the 21st century hint at kinship with the imaginative structures of the distant past. Given that we live in a moment that feels particularly fraught, it seemed worthwhile to spend this evening together wondering what we can learn about the kinship, if there is one, between those distant imaginings about conflict and concord in communication and our own. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for this very wide-ranging, rich overview of the power of poison as an idea, as a concept, as a metaphor, the discourse of poison, with a particular focus on communication in society and politics, the role of poison in literature, in conflicts represented in epic poetry and Greek tragedy. You've taken us through a whole range of area showing the richness of the applications of this concept. As a medical historian, I was, of course, delighted by the medical texts at the very end. I was reminded of the ancient discourse about toxicology, about venoms. There's a whole literature in the ancient world on poisonous spiders and scorpions and so forth. And two ideas are particularly striking there. The one is the deceitful nature of poisons. They're very tiny, you can't see them, but they produce enormous effects. So the disproportionateness between the tininess, the invisibility of poison and the enormous effects they produce. The other idea, which one finds in the medical writer Galen, is the ambivalence, which you mentioned, of the word pharmakon. Galen distinguishes between foods, drugs, and poisons, but he uses these words as functions. He says the same substance can act either as a food, sustaining the body, as a drug, changing the condition of the body, usually meant to be healing, restorative of health, or corrupting and destroying the condition of the body. So the same substance, depending on the circumstances of its application, the mode of application, the dosage, the conditions under which it is applied, can act in three different ways. And that was, I think, that came very powerfully through in your discussion of the ambivalence of the word poison. Now, we've got some time for questions. Maybe I'll just start with one question, because we're dealing with conflicts, but we're also dealing with how to resolve them, ways of resolving them. And when one thinks of conflicts in terms of poisonous language, poisonous communication, one also thinks, when it comes to resolution, of antidotes, of counteracting forces. And I wondered if you could say something about that, the idea of an antidote as a metaphor applied to conflict resolution.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful, so the reason I actually chose poison to address the question of conflict and resolution was to make, I know it's an obvious point, but to make the point that in a cosmos in which, at least in the pre-modern cosmos, in which things are always thought of as balances between, so the Galenic model, for example, what seems to be a conflict in one moment may be, or a poison in one moment is a medicine or nourishment in another. The same holds for conflict and resolution. And we can never really say very easily what, we can't separate conflict and concord as easily as we think we can. And so that was a kind of basic point that I wanted to make that goes to your broader. But the fact is, people continue to think of antidotes as in some way separable from poison. I think maybe the most, I once did a count. I went through all the hand lists. I've done many things in my life that I have never used for any purpose. But I once went through all the hand lists of medical manuscripts that I could find from the Middle Ages. And I think manuscripts about poison accounted for a plurality. And manuscripts about universal antidotes, triaca, for example, accounted for a very sizable part of that plurality. In other words, people were always looking for an antidote that would be a universal antidote. It wouldn't be relative, like the Galenic model would imply that it should always be. I even found an 18th century manuscript that claimed that the universal antidote, this is in Hebrew, and it's at the Hebrew Union College Library in Cincinnati, is marijuana. So people are still looking. But my point really wanted to be more about the maintaining a sense of relativism when we claim something is conflict or something is resolution, maintaining a sense of relativism about the perspectives from which that would be true and other perspectives from which it would not be. Because I think it's, although we can all agree some conflicts are terrible, we can also agree that it's very difficult to achieve universal recognition of a resolution.
Okay, there is opportunity for questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, could you please move to one of the microphones that are on the stairs, so that we can, that is good for the recording of this meeting. Are there any questions? I'm also blinded by the light, but I can just about, would anyone like to raise a question? Yes, Dagmar Schäfer.
It's quite a challenge to ask a question from down there. So thank you very much for this brilliant overview. I have a question regarding your entry into the question of communication. So at the beginning, you gave us a whole linguistic array of terms that basically, if I understood you correctly, if basically saying like communication is a gift and it's poison, yeah? So I was wondering, like, if you bring these different linguistic traditions together, or this culture, how you can actually really deal with this ambiguity. Are you meaning to say that communication is actually like the poison and the gift to a society of its holding together, and that is a commonly shared tradition across these European traditions that you were actually mentioning?
Yeah, I'm afraid I was kind of suggesting that. I'm not trying to say that communication is poison, but I am trying to say that these roots contain within themselves both the meaning of the action of holding together society, communication that hold the sweet chains that bind, as Cicero calls language, and the implication also of the disordering power of language. They never thought, I mean, the roots themselves contain that ambivalence and don't try to separate it out. And I think that ambivalence always remains. In that sense, maybe, you know, we tend to write the histories of our personalities. Irving Goffman, for example, the great sociologist of interactionist sociology, was very bad at human relations. So he had to write out kind of rules for human relations, and that's why he approached that. And maybe I'm a paranoid person and tend to think always, like a little bit like Achilles looking at Odysseus, that man hides something in his heart and I can't see it, right? That the fact we all know that we have a split subjectivity. And manners are in some sense the most exquisite aspect of that. They're crucial for society. Without manners, we'd all be killing each other. But at the same time, they also fill us all with an awareness that you're thinking something other than what you're telling me. And that creates an insecurity. And all I'm trying to suggest is that double potential has been present in all of the key words of our political culture, our community communication, etc., from very, very early times. And that ambivalence tells us something about how we should be thinking about conflict and resolution in our own time. I don't know what it tells us. I think there are many different histories we could write. Each one would give us a different lesson, but it tells us something. It tells us this is a very rich area to mine. And then when we talk about conflict and resolution, those are already ideas that are almost inseparable in our archaic vocabulary. And that's why I brought in Norbert Elias. I want to say it's not only our Indo-European roots, our own theories as political scientists, as historians of comparative politics, already in code, have adopted, have internalized, and then repeated many of these ideas. So that was, you know, the late Harry Belafonte had a song. He said, "It was clear as mud, but it covered the ground." And that's kind of a description of what I just did, but yes.
Are there any further questions, please? Questions can also be asked in German, of course. Feel free. There were two ideas that I found that I would just like to pick up briefly to, maybe you can elaborate on them. The one was the idea of that someone can, as it were, diagnose the poison in a particular substance, can, as it were, detect it. and, well, probably then take precautionary action or prevent other people from using it. And the other idea was the idea of the immunity against poison, which in the quotation from I think from Matthew. Could you elaborate on those ideas? What's their significance? What aspects of the poison discourse do they reveal? What kind of people are being portrayed as having these skills?
Yeah, it is. Saint Augustine said you should never try to say everything in one sermon. And in this one sermon, I did bring in a lot of different issues, and one of them was the use of poison resistance or poison immunity in sectarian debate, both in the early Israelite community or in the Israelite community, and then in the early Christian community, and then also in the Islamic. And we see it in all of them, and very often Benedict is a good example. People try to poison him. The people trying to poison him are other Christians, and his poison resistance is a way of articulating the superiority of his. The same thing happens to Abelard, by the way. I mean, this is a motif that goes on and on and on. And in Islam, it's actually more interesting. There are some Christian saints who are poisoned and die and then are sainted, but it's rare. Whereas in Islam, Muhammad himself is said to detect the poison in the sheep shoulder he takes a bite of that is given to him by this Jewess who has tried to poison him. And so he saves his followers, but he did take one bite, and that bite is thought in some traditions to have been what eventually killed him, so that Muhammad was not only a prophet, but also a martyr. And in that sense, you see poison playing a double. It can be detected, but it's also a passion, also a suffering, a martyrdom. I think these are very powerful tools. We often, what is this called? Trial by ordeal. Poison is often used as a trial by ordeal between religions in this sense. So you have practitioners of one group or opponents of one person who are all killed by the poison, and the other survives. I find these fascinating because they do point to, and even Augustine took it up, right? But they do point to a desire to say poison can give us a clear truth. At the same time, I find it disappointing because it cleaves that ambivalence that I'm trying to say is always present. And even someone like Augustine insisting on the fact that pure evil does not exist, right? For Augustine, this relativism is an important position, the relativism of evil. And yet he does at some, and that's what the scorpion does for him. The scorpion proves that for him. But elsewhere, he's willing to say the true Christian can resist the poison of. So I find those moments when we give up on the complexity of the world disappointing. But that's just my personality. I think many, many people would turn to those moments and say, yes, there are foundations. It's not ambivalence all the way down. Poison can point us to moments of truth.
Yeah, and again, if one applies this metaphorically, we sometimes speak of a poisonous atmosphere or someone who is poisoning a climate in which people relate to each other. And if one then tries to apply this metaphor of someone who has the gift or the skill of detecting this poisonous element or neutralizing it, I mean, that would be another application of this idea.
That would be lovely. The word toxic in English today is used all the time and applied to the workplace. And people lose their jobs today because they're accused of creating a toxic atmosphere, a toxic workplace. It's a viral charge against many people. And there are examples. I skipped them in the presentation because it got long. But I was going to give two examples of people who were said to have used poison to create calm. One was Thomas à Becket, who was said to have used the courtier's poisonous tools, but to create good. And the other one was in the 17th century, people looking back at Socrates and saying, there's a man who said never dissimulate, but always dissimulated rhetorically and for the good, that this maieutic method of philosophy requires a kind of dissimulation, poisonous dissimulation. So yes, I think there are examples where people point to poison as to the use of poison, but not nowadays. In my world, in the US, to be called toxic is the kiss of death.
Well, we're not going to end on a toxic note. We're going to end on a, well, wine is waiting outside for us. So.
If anyone dares drink after this talk.
I'm sure it's not toxic. Thank you very much for this excellent and most stimulating Auftakt to our annual theme. It's been tremendously stimulating and thought-provoking. Thank you so much, David. Thank you all for coming to this event. And of course, conversation and discussion can continue over a glass of wine in the reception room outside. Thank you very much for coming. Have a pleasant evening.